Great. Well, thank you so much, and it's great to be on stage with you.
Pleasure. My pleasure.
So your book is, I'll start out, by the way, when they told us that we would be following an event with Caitlyn Jenner, I almost reconsidered because that's a tough act to follow, but we're going to do our best. Your book, just to start from the very beginning, you dedicated to Siddhartha Mukherjee and Carrie Buck. And those stories, I realized that late in reading the book, but it makes a lot of sense because their stories really suffuse the book in one way or another. And I'm just curious, why did you choose to look at the story of genes through those stories? And can you tell us a bit about both of them?
Sure. The way that I thought about this book came to me because of a series of questions that were part of my first book, The Emperor of All Maladies. There were really three strands that come together in this book, and this brings us to Carrie Buck and my grandmother, Siddhartha Mukherjee. The first strand was the astonishing changes in technology, particularly around genetics. So let me illustrate that idea just so that we really begin to understand it. If, say, your genome was written in script and printed on a piece of paper, it would be written down as a book. It would be about 70 full volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, so 70 full sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And so every room in this auditorium, every wall, in this auditorium would be lined with the encyclopedia of your genome. And if you picked out, book 17 in set 64, looked at page 7, you would read ACT, GCCT, CCC, GGG, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, of course, it gets chemically modified beyond just that, but that would be the core code of instructions. And yet, your first cell knows how to build you out of that core set of instructions. So that was known now for a long time. But what had begun to change in the last 10 odd years, and we were following, as a scientist, as a physician, I was following this because these technologies were coming into my own hands and into my own laboratory. We began to, as a community of human beings, scientists, began to discover technologies that allow us now to understand the beginnings. We're far from the full understanding, but understand the beginnings of what this code means for an individual human being. So, for instance, you can now predict if your child is likely to have Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis in a way that you couldn't certainly 50 or 100 years ago. But more importantly, we were inventing technologies that allow us, and it really boggles the mind, so let me just be clear about this, inventing technologies that allow us to go into volume 17 in set 364, or whatever it might be, and go to page 86 and erase one word and switch it to another word. That technology obviously affects the way we think about ourselves. This is a machine that's now begun to learn its own codes of instructions. By this I mean human beings. Our machines that have begun to learn the codes of the manual is becoming open to us. So the question was, who has stewardship of that manual? Is it you? Is it me? How do we make sense of that moment in which you begin to understand, begin to decipher the manual of your own instructions? So that was one strand. It sort of felt as if you had to write about it. I had to write about it as a physician, as a scientist, because it seemed to me that these technologies would make the current concerns about other technologies, social media, et cetera, seem totally trivial. Totally, entirely trivial. So that was one strand. The second strand was all of that information was now funneling into my clinical practice through cancer. So trying to understand, you can sequence the active parts of a cancer genome for an individual patient. How would that affect the way we thought about patients, et cetera? That was the second strand, but perhaps the most important strand is the one you're talking about, which is that my own family has a history of genetic illness in it. An illness that we don't fully understand, an illness where there's definitely a role of the environment, there's definitely some role of chance, but schizophrenia and bipolar disorder have crossed multiple generations. As I wrote this book, I had a cousin who was institutionalized and permanently institutionalized in a hospital for having schizophrenic, for having a kind of a deep variant of a schizophrenic disorder. So this history wasn't foreign to me. This was my story. And so those three strands came together in this book. Now, why Carrie Buck? Why my grandmother? Carrie Buck was, many of you know, people who've read the book certainly know, but this was knowledge that's been around in the history books of the United States. Carrie Buck was a woman who was sterilized for supposedly carrying a gene for imbecility or stupidity, feeble-mindedness. It turns out when you look through her story, when you look through her history, it was largely nonsense. There was no such thing. But she, by state mandate, she was sterilized because, as Oliver Wendell Holmes opined, he said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So it was an attempt to purify, to cleanse the American racial gene pool from Carrie Buck's imbecility. And so against her own wishes, she was taken to an operating room and her ovaries were removed in order to prevent her genetic lineage from being carried forward, because she was thought to be one of the people who was contaminating the otherwise healthy American gene pool. So that moment is our moment. We are inheritors of that history. We can't forget it. We can't bury it under the blankets as we move forward into this genetic future where we can supposedly, change active parts of our genome or parts of our genome, read and write the genome. And so and she resisted the idea. She protested and ultimately was taken to this moment of sterilization against her will. This idea of resisting one's genetic future, of thinking about our own identity and fate in different ways and perhaps more humane ways, was something that my grandmother also embodied, because she too had to weather the buffets of her genetic history. So that's the reason these two people come together in the beginning of the book. In fact, when I first wrote, the first draft of the book began with Carrie Buck. She opened the book. And I felt that, so the book began sort of like with a kind of cold slap in your face. And eventually I moved Carrie Buck to the middle because I felt that people wouldn't even be able to enter the history. It was such a, it was such a cold wash in your face that less than, 100 years ago in this country where we now speak about freedom and equality and the idea of evidence as a mechanism of intervening or thinking about intervening on individuals' fates, that you would have a woman who was sterilized against her will for carrying actually no real sign of genetic imbecility. So that's a very long answer to your question, but it really tells you about the arc of this particular book.
One of the things that I didn't know before reading that part of your book is the lengths that they went to try to establish evidence in this case. They felt that they needed, for example, to have evidence from her daughter that it was 3 generations, and the testimony is amazing. It's like, she has this look, and that's presented as evidence in the pseudoscientific sort of way in which it was approached is pretty chilling.
Right. And of course, the reason, in fact, some of this is reproduced verbatim in the book from the original case, which you can read about, and the transcript of the case exists. And I decided that, truth is not just stranger than fiction, is often more chilling. And so I decided to reproduce it verbatim in the book, because you want to know what happened. What did the lawyers say? Put it in the context of your own, let's talk about ourselves. What if someone were to say to me, gosh, you have this genetic history of schizophrenia. Maybe we should control and figure out what children you should have and shouldn't have. Or make it even more provocative. Let's say I would tell you that in 5 years, we would begin to have technologies that would allow you to diagnose the possibility of a child having a future risk of autism, let's say debilitating autism, at a risk of 10%. So based on the read of the genome, the chance that your child had a debilitating variant of autism was 10%. How many of you would choose not to carry that child? And the answer would be, there are people in the audience who would, in this audience, I know every audience that I've spoken to would decide not to carry that child. What if that number was 50%? What if that number was 70%? What if, like me, you began to have the opportunity, again, 10 years, 15 years from now, to diagnose, based on genetic sequencing, a propensity of a child in my family to have schizophrenia? What if you made that diagnosis before the child had any symptoms? I have 2 daughters. What if only one of them, both are healthy, what if one of them turned out to carry that mark? Would it change the way you thought about them in the future? There are men and women in the world where only one child, based on their genetic history, only one child will have a future risk of Huntington's disease. Do they treat those 2 children? Right now the 2 children are identical. 3 children. Do they treat those children differently? Should we? So very, very, very quickly, these questions penetrate into who we are. How will we think about ourselves in 5, 10, 15 years from now? What will our children think once they acquire even deeper capacities to intervene on things that clearly, although not unilaterally, but clearly influence diffuse aspects of ourselves, diffuse aspects of our identity, diffuse aspects of how we think about ourselves? As I said, the fundamental question, what happens when a machine begins to decipher its own manual of instruction?
So this jumps ahead in the discussion a little bit, but now that you mention the idea of sort of eradicating a condition before the fact, before someone is born, in some ways the history of gene therapy, and you go through it in the book quite a bit, to some extent I think in the last few decades it's one of expectation of great ruin or great promise, and not a lot of delivery on those things to some extent, right? I mean, I remember going through and trying to see if we could find evidence that there were fewer Down syndrome children born now, for example. That evidence is actually a little hard to come by, right? So I wonder if you think, are we being lulled into a sense of false security in the fact that some of these slopes haven't been slipped down and that some of these things have not happened yet, or is it a function of the technology just becoming to the point now where those things are more realistic that we should fear them?
So I think some slopes have been very much slipped down, to use your language. In parts of the world, many of you might know, there are 800 female infants to 1,000 male infants. You don't need me to tell you that's a profoundly unnatural ratio. Right. And that is, in large part, although we don't know exactly, that is in large part because of a combination of genetic selection. In other words, I mean, just to be very clear about it, the abortion of female children, babies, and some degree of neglect of early female babies as well. In either way, however you do it, that is a dysgenic process. It's eugenics in its grotesque form. And it's already happened. It's not as if we're thinking about the future of eugenics. People say, oh, what if we come into a future of eugenics? And I say, well, go to northern India or China, parts of China. You will see the future of personalized human eugenics right there. You don't need to dream about changing the Encyclopedia of Genetic Instruction. So some slopes have already been slipped down. The promise of the potential to cure terrible human diseases also is being realized. Sickle cell disease, there are now multiple attempts at correcting the genetics of in blood stem cells. This is work that allied to what I do in my own medical and laboratory practice. I'm a hematologist. So on the other hand, the capacity to really have powerful effects on human lives. What you're talking about is the promise is still in the future. The technologies are evolving rapidly. What I did not mention in that suite of technologies that I talked about, reading and writing genetic information, the one thing that I did not mention was making strands of DNA, chromosomes, human chromosomes, from scratch as a chemical. In other words, now, potentially, if you could achieve that, you wouldn't have to go and erase things written into a human chromosome. You could build it, you could write it from scratch, like writing a novel. Obviously, each one of these technologies has limitations. But as I said, the fundamental idea that we are beginning to open that book, to read it, to write it, and change it, has to be one of the most important technological advances in human history, and brings with it, of course, all the challenges that really radical technologies bring.
Yeah, you put it in the context of the great fundamental sort of ideas and entities of the 20th century being the gene, the bite, and the atom, right? Yeah. These three, and certainly it's in that, that class.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to get back to where things are going in the field and some looming issues. But just to circle back for a second to the personal component of the book, because what I really love about your book is something that, to be honest, annoys me about some Hollywood movies that deal with science. But it's great in your book because sometimes when Hollywood, believe me, when Hollywood will go into a scientific subject, there's sometimes an apologetic tone to it, like we have to put in some personal interest in this or people won't watch it. So they'll throw in a love interest or family conflict, and sometimes that's made up out of whole cloth just so that you can tell the story a little more easily. But here, it's fundamental to the subject, right? I mean, like you have the quote from Homer in the beginning. That your parents' blood is not lost in you. It's like, that's about inheritance, right? It's about mothers and fathers and who you have children with and, your ancestors, your descendants, and, some very fundamental things about human nature. So that sort of leads into, you have a very evocative word in this book that I had not heard of before, but I think is a way of getting at the subject that's a little different. And I asked you how to pronounce it, Abaid. Could you talk a little bit about Abaid and what that, your father talked about it to you and what that sort of means to you personally?
Yeah, it's a very interesting and complicated word, and it certainly sends a kind of chill up when I think about it. My father passed away in the last 6 months, so this is a sort of a personal reflection on him too. But there is no Bengali word for gene. And there's a moment in the book when my father takes me back to Calcutta, where he came as a refugee, as a young boy, and he's looking for a word, for the word gene. And he knows what it generally should sound like or be like. Not sound like, but what the concept should convey. And ultimately, he thinks a while and he says the word should be abhed, which means the indivisible, that something that cannot be removed from yourself, a unit that cannot be removed out of yourself. And of course, it's a very lovely word from Sanskrit. which refers to the idea of that which is essential to you, that which is indivisible, that which is so much a part of you that it cannot be removed. It is beyond divisibility, which of course has resonances in the idea of the atom, beyond divisibility, atomistic. The idea of the byte or the bit, really, of information. You can't divide 1 and 0 further. They become unitary at that place. And ultimately, the idea of the gene, because you can certainly look and decipher what a gene is made of, but there's a unitary quality to it. It is a unit. It occurs in itself. So these deep resonances, which keep coming up over and over again, in ways that are important. Then comes the last chapter of the book, because I didn't know how to end this book. I had no idea how to finish this book, and I tried and I tried. I wrote various ways to end the book. I tried to go back to Calcutta to try to see my cousin in what my father used to call the lunatic asylum, because he lacked words for it, and he was so ashamed of carrying this kind of germinal seed of a flaw inside him.
It was 2 of his brothers.
2 of his brothers,
Yeah.
yeah. 2 of his brothers, and then one of his nephew, his oldest brother's son.
That's one of us, yeah.
So I tried to finish this book, and I was trying, and I tried. And then I remembered years ago listening to a strand of music where that word bhed was used. And I'll just read it to you because I'm going to forget otherwise.
Please.
This strand of music was kind of astonishing because it was an extract from a Sanskrit poem, then translated into a colloquial language. And the epilogue is called Bhed. So obviously the word bhed is the opposite of a bhed. It just takes the bhed and translates into bhed. And that means discrimination, to discriminate, to divide, to distinguish, to cut apart. And the poem, when I translated it, I'd heard it so many times, but when I translated it, all of a sudden it made so many things clear. And the poem, I'm going to read the translation. You can read the original in the book. It says, "Show me that you can divide the notes of a song, but first show me that you can discern between what can be divided and what cannot." We should spend some time thinking about that idea. This was written in Sanskrit in 1,000 odd years ago, maybe 2,000 odd years ago. But this idea that what does divisibility mean for us human beings? And think about this in the context of the gene. What if I told you that we were comprised of these units? That we had these unitary gene variations that we inherited, that governed our form, fate, and function, interacted with the environment, interacted with chance, but laid powerful constraints on our future and identity, right? What if I told you that these were units and that you could change pieces of this in a unitary manner, which you could not do if they were all interlinked together? If they were all meshed up together in some kind of whirlpool or spool, you couldn't take part A and excise it or eliminate it. So the aspiration of human eugenics, the aspiration of trying to manipulate genes, arises as a direct consequence of the fact that they are units as opposed to all enmeshed together. And yet we also know that they are enmeshed together, that they don't act alone, they act with each other. So there you have the fundamental contradiction of what the new genetics is telling us, that these things act together and yet they're divisible and separate. Abhed and bhed, this contrast with each other. And so I'm now going to read you again this thing, which really took me, because I had heard this song. It was you can find it on YouTube actually. I'd heard this song maybe 100 times in my life, and then all of a sudden I was writing the last chapter of the book, and I said to myself, someone 1,500 years ago wrote this: "Show me that you can divide the notes of a song, but first show me that you can discern between what can be divided and what cannot. It's an astonishing idea, and of course a very important idea in the 21st century.
Yeah. And it reminds me, too, of something in the book where you talk about actually gender identity and sexual preference and sort of the story of research into the genetic component of that. And one of the things that was striking was that, and this is, I think a lot of us sort of understand this intuitively, but that by portraying these things as in some way based in genetics, that kind of helped to normalize it for some people, right? That was seen as better than if they were being chosen in some way. And of course, the fact that now maybe you can choose the genetics adds a different layer to it. Yeah.
I mean, I think we're obviously entering a new era of choice. The choice is now being, the word choice is, again, the meaning of choice is changing. How we choose to describe choice is changing. There's a line in the book where I say choice sometimes seems like an illusion devised by genes to allow us to choose genes. And that's not a laughing matter, since in fact, as we move into an era where the idea of choosing your child's genome becomes more tactile, becomes more palpable, becomes potentially more real. And I don't mean choosing your child's genome, I don't mean, I mean small things that we're already doing. Right. Choosing not to have a child with Down syndrome is choosing a genome. Choosing to have a child who's male versus female is choosing a genome. Choosing a child that does not have Huntington's disease, or the mark of the genes that will predispose this child in 30 years' time to have Huntington's disease, is choosing a genome. A woman, I wrote a piece about this recently. I was at a conference, at a cancer conference, and I stepped off the podium, and a woman said, I have a history of breast cancer in my family. I have the BRCA1 gene mutation, the gene variant that increases risk of breast cancer. I would like my children never to suffer the consequences that I went through of, bilateral mastectomy, hormone therapy, chemotherapy, et cetera, et cetera. How can you not be sympathetic to that idea? So how can you not say that in certain circumstances we should be choosing certain genomes? And yet, on the other hand, looms Carrie Buck. Yet, on the other hand, looms the idea that if we had unmitigated powers to do this, what would happen next? Francis Collins and I, the gene was the NIH's the first institute-wide read book. Yeah. It's a new program that was launched at the NIH, in which they choose one book through the year and they read it.
One read. Right?
One read, yeah. And we were on stage, and Francis, we were just sort of finishing our conversation, and he said, he suddenly asked a question which I wasn't expecting. He said, what do you think, what normal human trait do you think is going to go first? And I sort of thought about it for a while, and I said, gender aside, which has already gone down your slope, as it were, I said height. And all of you might have your own answers. First of all, the question is, what's normal, right?
What's normal?
The answer is we don't know. And the book, much of the book has questions, tries to gnaw like a mouse at the roots of what is normal. I don't have the answer. I provide some thoughts about it, but so those questions are. But I think height will go first. Right. Height will be the first entrance into Gattaca.
And of course, Francis Collins, known for his work on cystic fibrosis.
Yes, of course.
And that's a condition that, to my knowledge, has no positive benefit for society. It'd be great if people didn't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
But in some ways, the natural condition of people is to have a high.
Just pause for a second,
yeah,
because actually you said something very important.
Yeah.
Which we need to question a little bit.
Please.
You said cystic fibrosis has no natural benefit for society.
Well, right.
But
okay.
The cystic fibrosis gene The gene variant that causes cystic fibrosis, we don't know this, comes into existence because of cholera. It was selected, we think, there's strong evidence for this, that in societies where cholera and other gastrointestinal diseases raged rampantly through the population, having that mutation actually protected children. When you had one copy of the mutation, those children were protected from cholera. So how easily in 2017 the idea that cystic fibrosis has no benefit slips off our tongues.
It does.
Right? And yet, in evolutionary history, you would be so lucky to have one copy, but not the second copy, but one copy of the mutant gene. I mean, it's a great example of how quickly because environments change, because societies change, how quickly we change, what our eugenic aspirations are.
And we didn't plan that. I fell right into that. So, and sickle cell anemia, same thing. It's the parasite. Help me out here. The disease, malaria. Right. So sickle cell anemia is thought to have maybe had some benefit from malaria. A number of other genetic disorders that might have some basis.
Possibly BRCA1.
Right. So that gets to a question that I was thinking of bringing up later, which is, that we have this idea of, and I just fell into it, of genetic differences or disorders as being in some way subsets or sort of deviations from the normal, right? And that there's the normal, and then there's something less than that, and that's contained in these things. But you bring up the point that some of the genes that affect things like schizophrenia and other conditions, there are benefits to that too, right? There are aspects of faculties that might be enhanced by the same thing that causes all these problems. So none of them is straightforward.
Many of them are not. I mean, so again, we have to use some, obviously, you're referring to this idea. We obviously have to use some discretion and some discrimination in talking about, there are two strands to this, right? So there are conditions, as you're very well pointing out, where inheriting that genetic mutation doesn't seem to have any ameliorative effects.
Right.
A child with a debilitating form of autism, really we are compelled to ask the question, why should we not remove this from the human gene pool? So again, it really depends on thinking about the deep consequence of each individual piece of this, as it were.
Right. And of course, the natural state of our species is to have high infant mortality rates and to have no recourse when we get cancer and all these other things that we're very happy that medicine's provided answers for.
What's natural? What's natural? What is the natural state?
What is natural? Exactly, right?
What is the natural state of anything, right?
Yeah. Hundreds or thousands of years ago, that's what would have happened, right? And so it's a good thing that we've changed those, but that's, So one thing that you talk about in this book that's interesting is just the way that the ideas about genetics and what is a gene and what's the unit of inheritance have changed so much over time. And maybe in some ways that's a cautionary tale of the fallibility of very smart people who got it completely wrong, starting with whoever you want to start with. But Darwin had a very wrong-headed idea of what heredity amounts to. So how did that fit into the arc of the book for you?
Yeah. So, this was a strange book to write, partly because the first half of this book really is a setup, like a theatrical setup for the second half of the book. In this particular book, it's very different in structure from The Emperor of All Maladies or The Laws of Medicine, which are very different structurally. This is a harder book to write, because the payoff comes at the end. And I think the payoff is rich at the end. I hope it is. Otherwise, you shouldn't read it. But the payoff comes at the end because the payoff comes with questions about, now that we know all this, what do we do about it? So the second full half of the book is that. The first half of the book is very condensed. It's a condensed history. We zoom through decades, through era, and I didn't want to dwell too long because I didn't want, again, to to, I just wanted to get to the meat of the second half of the questions. I'll just give you a couple of highlights of the deep past of genetics because it's interesting. So, for the longest time, and I think I'm sure people in this audience remember this or maybe think this themselves. For the longest time, people, the idea of heredity was very intuitive for the longest time. People thought that, you were a kind of wearing blender of your parents. Your parents, your mother had certain characteristics, your father had certain characteristics. They got mixed together and you became you. And it makes a lot of intuitive sense. Your skin color is often the average of your mother and father. Your height is an average. Your hair color, your hair formation, etc. is an average. But of course, it took a few philosophers of the ancient world to figure out that couldn't be true, because if that were true, how would you explain gender? Obviously,
That would get weird.
it creates an immediate philosophical problem, because why aren't all of us the average of our parents' sexual anatomy, our parents' gender identity, and so forth? So obviously, something more was at play. And if you think deeply about that, in fact, what's astonishing about it in retrospect, this idea that Mendel had, that information must be moving in an indivisible form, is apparent from gender itself, right? If you really think about it for a second. How else could it work? How else could you guarantee that you would have male and female, not across one generation, but across generation after generation after generation? How else could it possibly work unless there was some one piece, two pieces, 10 pieces, whatever it might be, the number is irrelevant, was moving indivisibly across generations, that it wasn't being diluted out, hopefully, because otherwise, anatomy would collapse, or sexual dimorphism would collapse, and so forth. So it's.
Of course, the oldest idea was that it was all homunculus, right?
That's right. So
there's a
a lovely
yes.
illustration in the book. So the oldest idea was that there was none of this was true. So the oldest idea was that you came completely preformed, and you were sort of a little baby in the sperm, a little folded human being in the sperm, and your mother just added water, basically. So you blew up and became your manifest self.
The soil.
Exactly. So the female in this version was a kind of intravenous nutrient bag, and the male was the determinant. Of course, if you think about that, that makes also no sense for the same reasons I just told you. If the male specified, the idea was that this homunculus gathered information from the body and therefore formed itself by sort of picking out information. But if the homunculus, in the case of a female child, where did the homunculus get the information to make its anatomy? If it was,
although it's a very evocative idea, I have to say, in some ways, because I think one of the things you point out is that in religious terms, it implies that if you believe this, right, that Adam contained all future human beings, and that there was a beginning that also experienced original sin, and that there is an expected end to that line, which is kind of neat if it worked that way, but it doesn't.
I know, that's why you shouldn't believe it.
Right.
There's yet one more reason why you shouldn't believe it.
So, as you said, you go from this saga of understanding what the gene is to the task of which has become greater and greater in recent decades of gene therapy and where that's heading and what the moral foundation is for that. So, if you could maybe summarize, where has gene therapy, to your mind, sort of gone in the last few decades, and where does it stand now? I think you have a pretty clear view that we're potentially at a precipice of some much more powerful techniques than existed before.
So yes, absolutely. So just to give you a little bit of a primer on the idea, again, much of this is in greater detail in the book. For the once we had figured out what genes were, where they were located, how they manifest themselves in the body, etc. You could imagine ways in which you could take diseased tissue, where the tissue itself was diseased as a consequence of a genetic mutation, and you could put a foreign gene into that tissue, carried by a virus, for instance. And this was, of course, the way gene therapy was imagined in the 1990s and early 2000s that say you had cystic fibrosis, so your whole body, every cell in your body has the mutant version, in this case, 2 mutant versions of the gene, but mainly the disease is manifest in your lungs, although that's manifest in other organs as well. So the goal of gene therapy was, what if you could put the right gene into the lungs at least, and then the lungs would start functioning again. So this idea is called somatic gene therapy, and it's important to know those words. Somatic gene therapy refers to the idea that your soma, or your body, is being affected, but your germline is not being affected. The genes don't go into your sperm and eggs.
You would still have people with that.
That's right. So if a child treated with this gene therapy, in the case of cystic fibrosis, were to have his or her child, that child would never have that gene corrected, right? They would still have the parental version of whatever the genes were. And there have been some seminal successes in somatic gene therapy, although there have been big challenges as well. The biggest challenge is that it's pretty hard to deliver genes into the human body. The body doesn't seem to be particularly happy receiving viruses, for instance. So it's tricky to do it. You can, and there have been some important successes, sickle cell disease being potentially one of them, but other hemophilias, blood disorders being others in which they've been attempted. But they've not been. So somatic gene therapy has important advantages. Separate from somatic gene therapy is a much more provocative and controversial idea, and that is germline gene therapy. What if you could now change sperm and eggs in a way that you could change the genetic information? You could either deliver genes into them, or you could make corrections, changes, edit the genes of sperm and eggs. Now that idea was considered a pipe dream. People thought that this was impossible, that we'd never find technology to do this. And then something surprising happened. And you go through it in the book, and you really need to go through the story to figure out why it's surprising. So the idea that you could deliberately change, as I said before, deliberately change word 35 in paragraph 4 of volume 17 and set 62, change GGG to CCC, was thought impossible. You can't tell a cosmic ray, which causes mutations, you can't say, go and change just that. Or you can't tell an X-ray, go and change just that. You have no control. And then something very, very, very strange happened. It was serendipitous, and it was a discovery. It turns out that bacteria, the bacteria live on the rough edges of the world, right? So they live in the hard side of the tracks. They're constantly being invaded by other organisms, particularly viruses. And so bacteria have evolved. We didn't know anything about this. This was totally hidden to us. But over millennia, bacteria have evolved mechanisms to resist viruses. And we knew some of these mechanisms before, and they were very tantalizing. One mechanism that the bacteria had evolved to resist viruses, they would cut the virus DNA as it was trying to invade the bacteria. Again, we knew about this, we knew a lot about this, Nobel Prizes were awarded for this information, etc. And then it turned out that many scientists, but I really should identify Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, discovered that this system was programmable. In other words, you could program the system, and in fact, bacteria had learned to program this system so that they could chop a piece of DNA based on its sequence in a directional manner. It was as if it had told, not a cosmic ray, but a bacterial system, said, go and find that sequence and cut it. And you'll be able to, and that's the way that you can, recognize that virus is coming and invading you. Now, it just takes 2 steps to figure out where we're going with this, which is if bacteria can learn to do this, why don't we re-engineer that system to allow human cells to do this? So in other words, why don't we re-engineer human cells to say, go to volume 17, page whatever, set whatever, cut that piece of information and potentially change that piece of information using some intrinsic properties of cells. So these are the new, this is the kind of gene therapy that's sort of coming on our horizon, which is the potential to have germline gene therapy. And just before we finish up, let me just tell you one thing, which is an important thing. The National Academy of Sciences, actually after I finished this book, about a month ago, released a report, which we should really note. So the National Academy of Sciences was asked, many panels have been asked, I've been involved in some of them, but I was not with the National Academy panel, but many panels have been asked, should we limit this? And the National Academy of Sciences, for the first time in human history, said for diseases that cause extraordinary suffering, if we really think that, if for diseases that cause extraordinary suffering, as long as there's no other justifiable intervention, that scientists should be allowed to consider germline human gene therapy, gene editing. That is a big deal. Many of us had thought that the Academy would say, no, stop. But it decided it's a big deal. So the question is, what is extraordinary suffering? Who decides? Is it extraordinary suffering to be a woman in a society there where women do face extraordinary suffering? Is that enough? Is it extraordinary suffering to have the BRCA1 gene mutation? Who defines it? So the panel has told us a standard, but that standard itself, when you examine it, becomes a question, leads to a series of questions. And of course, we're not talking about some irrelevant thing like social media. We're talking about, I'm just joking. I'm just joking. But we're talking about the stewardship of the thing that defines us as human.
Right.
So if we don't know the vocabulary, if we don't understand the words, if we don't participate in this conversation, we're going to be left out.
And as you say, one of the principles of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis has been that there should be a very high likelihood that the gene in question would cause some kind of disorder. Well, who defines that? 10% for some people would be high, for others it would be different. So how are we on time? Do we have a little time for Q&A? Great. Any questions? Yeah, down in front.
There's two microphones roving around here. I'm trying to get to as many as I can. Let's start with back here. Can you pass this over?
Great.
Sure. So I appreciated the dialogue on normative behavior and kind of what norms are. And twice you kind of poked at social media, which was funny. But this new book, Sapiens, that's out, sort of takes a twist on normatives and imagination and how those happen. And it's sort of interesting to think about kind of the social media world as developing our norms and reflecting them on us, vis-a-vis our genetics as well, because there's this sort of a computer social world that's happening that reflects our ideas too. So I'm just curious if you think about how ideas exist in that world, and then how atomic expressions exist in genes and how those two interplay.
So, by the new book, you mean Homo Deus, not Sapiens, is that correct? So you mean Sapiens. In fact, I reviewed Homo Deus for the New York Times. I admire Harari's writing. I think he's a very thoughtful person on the future. So how these two pieces intersect together, the future of, it's kind of hard to define, they're little nebulous entities, but the future of, let's say, computational algorithms and the future of biological algorithms, how they intersect with each other. Both of them are ultimately information-rich systems. If you want a very long answer to that, do read the review. Not to plug the review, because what's nice about plugging reviews is that there's no books attached to it, at least for me. Maybe you'll go and see. Maybe you'll go and read Harari's book. I didn't agree with everything that Harari has to say about how these intersect, but I think the idea is very powerful that there are two kinds of algorithms, as I'm using the word from that book. There are two kinds of algorithms that are intersecting in the future. One of them is genetic, and one of them is computational algorithms. These two algorithms have the capacity to interplay with each other. So I'll give you one concrete example. How we predict the future of biological organisms, including humans, of course, depends on an information-rich way of thinking about humans. So we have, if we sequence 10 million genomes, maybe 100 million genomes, I don't know what the number would have to be, and created a fate map of this looking forward of humans, would we begin to would we have enough power, and would we begin to get information about how the genome predicts your fate in the future? We have very little glimpses of this, right? So we know in a very tiny edge of that universe that if you inherit two variants of mutations in cystic fibrosis gene, that you will have a disease that affects your lungs, your pancreas, and your sperm, right? Or your spermatic system, I should say. That we know. If you have a mutation in a gene called BRCA1, in the future you'll have a risk of breast and other kinds of cancers as well. But we don't know this systematically, and particularly we don't know it combinatorially, which is probably the most important piece. If you have gene variant A and gene variant C and D, but not L, inclusive of X, but not Y, how this particular combination interacting together will lead to whatever it might be that your fate is. If that principle becomes available, if these pieces of understanding become understandable, if they become computationally amenable, then you can imagine an incredible power will be unleashed on human beings. The capacity to predict, obviously, diffuse aspects of future, not just such concrete things as diseases that we know have powerful genetic links, but much more diffuse aspects of our future. And that is something to be really thinking about, and I think that's the question that is raised. I think we're far from that place, but it seems to me that the technologies, the individual pieces of technology, which are genetic sequencing, creating very rich fate maps of human beings, doing this across multiple populations, and then finding enough computational power to imagine this in what would be called multidimensional space, and figuring out how they predict each other, or whether they do predict other. These individual pieces of technology, the data storage, have come to pass. So whether we want to do this or not is a question that I think is worth raising.
That idea of the fate map is very evocative in your book, and I think it gets to the fact that we know it's both genes and environment that have an impact on disease and other things, but the effect of environment is very difficult to quantify.
That's right. Yeah. It's an unusual thing, and I'll let this idea rest with you. It's an unusual thing that 50 years ago, people thought that the environment would be the most malleable component, right? People said, what we really should focus on is changing the environment. 50 years later, our language has changed. We think that, gosh, the environment's been too hard to tackle. Let's change the genes. That idea should provoke a huge internal conversation within ourselves, within our societies. What happens to society which has said our frustrations with changing environments has reached a place where we think that, let's change there are two halves of this equation, let's change the other half, potentially. That obviously has, I don't need to tell you that this has cultural consequences. Maybe there's a question right in front, sorry.
I'll get a microphone, and we are closing in on the end, so just like a minute or two more, please. Thank you.
This is somewhat related to that last point you were making on, the theory of epigenetics. Where do you fall on the nature versus nurture topic? And then I always think of, the movie Gattaca, for example. I think you call it out in this book, but where
one quote from Gattaca in the book.
Yeah, but as far as nature versus nurture, where do you think that goes, and how does this interplay with the whole concept of genes and being able to change your genetic makeup?
So my own views about this lie. I do think that we are discovering more and more, and I hold a relatively, for some people, a controversial edge of this topic. I think that nurture influences nature in ways that we haven't fully even discovered. Just last week, there were 3 important papers in model organisms that yet again show that the effects of nurture in these model organisms remains powerful. In the case of the worm, up to 14 generations, if I'm quoting the paper correctly, 14 generations were influenced. So the idea that nature could influence nurture, to use your words, not across one generation, not across two, but across multiple generations, I think for model organisms, simple model organisms, has become extremely powerful, at least very convincing for me. Others are not so convinced. I mean, it's a controversial topic. People debate this back and forth. But I think even last week's recent spate of papers, 3, highly detailed studies in model organisms, some in yeast and some in worms, makes a powerful argument that this is not to be taken lightly, that phenotypes get reproduced generation after generation based on an environmental exposure that the original organism. Lots of people disagree about this. It raises the specter of Lamarckian evolution, which I think has many problems. Of course, much of we know about genetics does not go through these mechanisms. But all of this said, I think that the convincing data, I think most people who are deniers of this idea really have their heads in the sand.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Do we have time for one more?
No, we cannot. I'm sorry. We have to get to the book signing now.
Sorry.
Yeah, so thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Siddhartha.